Africans must take a position and protect their turf. China wants to come and exploit Africa. They'll get away with it to the extent that Africans allow them. The United States wants to come and exploit Africa. They'll get away with it to the extent that the Africans will allow them. The question is, does Africa have an African position when they come to the negotiating table with the world? The answer right now is no. Africa must unite. Africa must speak with one voice, and Africa must go to the world stage with one voice, one agenda, one plan that the world will have to respond. But as long as Africa is going to the world as bitty little countries, as Togo, as Eswatini, as Guinea-Bissau, Africa is fighting a losing game.
It was one of the boldest visions of the 20th century, a United States of Africa. One currency, one army, one passport, one voice. A continent once carved up by colonizers coming together to reclaim its destiny. It wasn't a slogan. It was a serious movement. And in the 1960s, it almost happened. Almost. Today on The Breakdown, we're going back to the post-independence moment when Africa stood at a crossroads, unity or fragmentation, and chose the latter. We'll look at Kwame Nkrumah's radical vision, the deep divide between the Casablanca and Monrovia groups, and why, despite all the potential, African unity failed to materialize. But before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss another critical conversation like the one we're about to have. Now let's get into it. All right, so let's roll back the clock. The 1950s and 60s were electric. Colonies were falling. Flags were rising. And for the first time in centuries, Africans were in control of their own governments. But there was a problem. Africa was free, but it was fragmented. The borders we inherited were drawn in Berlin in 1884 to 1885. Arbitrary lines that split ethnic groups lumped rivals together and carved up the continent for European profit. By the early 60s, over 30 newly independent African nations had emerged. But everyone knew independence alone wasn't enough. Unity was the goal. Because divided, Africa was weak. But united, it could be a global force. Enter Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah wasn't just Ghana's president, he was Africa's loudest Pan-African voice. He believed that political independence without economic and military integration was an illusion. In his words, Africa must unite or perish. He envisioned a single African government, a continental military, a unified currency, and common citizenship, much like the United States of America. He pushed hard towards this vision. He hosted conferences. He built alliances. He even funded liberation movements in other African countries. That's right. But not everyone was on board. Because while Nkrumah was dreaming of one Africa, others were trying to hold their own fragile nations together. And that's when the split happened. In 1961, two major blocs formed with two very different visions for Africa's future. You had the Casablanca group, led by Ghana, Egypt, Algeria, Guinea, Mali, Libya, and Morocco. These were the radicals, the revolutionaries. They wanted immediate political union, no delay, no excuses. They were anti-Western, pro-socialist, and deeply invested in Nkrumah's Pan-African dream. Then you had the Monrovia group, led by Nigeria, Liberia, Ethiopia, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and most of Francophone Africa. These were the pragmatists, the cautious moderates. They believed in cooperation, but not at the expense of national sovereignty. Their motto was unity in diversity, not one government. They supported economic integration, cultural exchange, and collective diplomacy, but not a single African state. So while both groups agreed on the idea of unity, fundamentally they all agreed that it was good for the continent to be united. They clashed on what the method and pace would look like. Casablanca said, "Unite now." Monrovia said, "Let's take our time." Guess who won? In 1963, leaders from both camps met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to negotiate a path forward. The result? The creation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU. And that was a compromise. The OAU respected national sovereignty, it rejected interference in internal affairs, and it set up frameworks for cooperation, but no binding authority, no real integration, and no enforcement mechanisms. In other words, it was unity in theory. Now, the Casablanca's group's vision of a continental government was effectively dead. The Monrovia group's model, cooperation without integration, won the day. And that's the model Africa followed for the next 40 years. Why did it fail? We have to look at what went wrong, what really went wrong. Why did the dream of African unity unravel? Let's break it down. Number one, colonial legacy. The borders were bad, but the economic systems were worse. You see, French colonies were still tied to France. British colonies relied on British trade. Colonial powers had set up Africa to trade outward, not inward. So African economies weren't built to integrate. They were built to compete for the approval of Europe. Number two, ideological differences. Socialists versus capitalists, pro-West versus anti-West. Every country had its own idea of what development meant, and nobody wanted to hand over power to a supranational body. Number three, fragile new states. Most African leaders were managing new unstable countries. Internal divisions, ethnic rivalries, secessionist movements. They barely had control over their own borders, let alone a whole continental agenda. So yes, unity sounded good, but survival came first. And number four, foreign interference. Let's not forget, Europe and America had no interest in a powerful, united Africa. The CIA, the M16, the French DGSE, they were all active in Africa, and they fueled coups, assassinated leaders, and propped up allies to block continental unity. Nkrumah himself was overthrown in a coup in 1966 with the help of the CIA. The African Union replaced the OAU in 2002. It's more ambitious, more structured, and it's introduced promising initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, plans for a single African passport, and talk of a common currency, which, let's be honest, would be a game changer. But the reality here, most of the AU's goals remain aspirational. National interests still come first. Implementation has been slow, and trust between states is fragile. Yet, the need for unity has never been greater. In a world of blocks, right? You have BRICS, you have the EU, you have the ASEAN. Africa remains the most divided continent. And that division comes at a cost. Weak bargaining power, vulnerability to foreign exploitation, duplicated infrastructure, fragmented markets, and missed opportunities. What if, just what if, imagine for a second, in 1963, if the Casablanca group had won? What if African leaders had said, let's build one nation, from Cairo to Cape Town, from Dakar to Addis Ababa, and actually meant it. Let's imagine what that Africa could have looked like today. Instead of 54 small, often competing economies, we'd have one continental market with over 1.4 billion people, abundant land, and every mineral the modern world needs. Africa would be a superpower in global trade. No border delays, no tariffs on Ghanaian cocoa entering Nigeria, no visa hassles for a Kenyan working in South Africa. Imagine, a Ugandan doctor could actually work in Senegal. A Senegalese engineer could help build railways in Angola. A Nigerian fintech startup could scale across the continent without navigating 50 regulatory systems. One continental currency backed by African gold, oil, and human capital would reduce dependency on the dollar, the euro, or the CFA franc. One African military command could have prevented or contained genocides in Rwanda, civil wars in Liberia, Sudan, Ethiopia, DRC. No need to beg the UN or beg the US for blue helmets. We could have had an African Silicon Valley, an African Airbus, an African IMF. And on the world stage, imagine Africa negotiating trade deals, climate agreements, or peace talks, not just as individual nations, but as one united bloc. The same way the EU speaks for Europe and the US for North America, Africa would have a seat at the table, every table, with real power. Now, sure, it wouldn't have been easy. Unity wouldn't have erased our problems overnight, for sure. There would still be corruption, inequality, power struggles, but we'd be arguing in the same house instead of yelling across fences drawn by colonizers. We'd be building regional infrastructure, not redundant airports and competing ports. We'd be funding our own research, our own defense, our own stories. Most of all, we'd be building a future on our own terms. That's the Africa we never got. But it's the Africa that could still be. I'm an optimist. So where do we go from here? Africa had its moments, a real shot. In the 1960s, with fresh independence and fiery vision, the continent stood at a crossroads. One road led to unity. Another road led to fragmentation. We chose the latter. But that choice wasn't final. The dream didn't die. It just went dormant. Because the truth is, Africa still needs unity. Not for romantic speeches, but for survival. We need to unite to survive. We need unity to compete, to negotiate, to build real power. And Nkrumah's voice is still echoes. Africa must unite or perish. Africa must unite or perish. It's not too late, but the clock is ticking. Thanks for watching The Breakdown. If this episode taught you something, share it. Let's bring the conversation back, not just in history books, but in boardrooms, in parliaments, and in youth movements. Because the idea of a united Africa, yes, it failed once, but maybe, just maybe, that's not how the story ends. I want to hear from you. What do you think about this moment in history where Africa almost became one nation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, take care. Hey, you! Thanks so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe and join the family Also, visit face2faceafrica.com for your daily news and updates on what's going on within the global Black community so you can stay informed.